Hello everyone, welcome back to MOA Live Talks. Once again, I'm Dr. Heather Hatch. I'm the Collections Manager at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about taphonomy, but I just want to say before I get started, first of all, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate everybody who's been watching, leaving likes and leaving comments and so forth. If you do have any questions about what I'm saying, I will be able to see your questions and hopefully respond to them as we go. I'm also going to, once again, if I can get to the right page, leave a link to our donations page. As I've said before, we do really appreciate anybody who would like to leave us a donation. We are closed to the public at the moment, so we are like cut off from most of our regular revenue streams. So anything that you can chip in if you're enjoying these talks is very deeply appreciated, because it's a tough time for all kinds of cultural sectors right now where we're all shut down because of the pandemic. So I'm just going to drop, if I can get it to open for me, just going to drop in the comments a link to our donations page. Just in 2 minutes here, if it will open for me. So as I was saying, today I'm going to be talking about taphonomy. Thursday is our next talk. It's going to be part of our live talk series, but it's not actually going to be a live. We are going to have a pre-recorded talk by Dr. Neil Ferris, who is our Lawson Chair of Canadian Archaeology, and he's going to be talking about the Matthew Elliott site, which is a really interesting site that he actually worked on when he was working for the Ministry of Culture. I don't remember its name at the time, so a while ago now. So he's working for the province at the time, working on that site, and some of the artifacts that we have in our collections now from that site that belong to the Ministry of Heritage, Tourism, Sport and Culture Industries now collection are on our new Google Cultural Institute page or Google Arts and Culture page, and if you would like to have sort of a look through that, there's links on our main website, and I believe should be sprinkled throughout our Facebook as well. And some of those artifacts are featured on that page, and so he's going to use those as sort of, I think, a jumping off point to talk a little bit about the site in a bit more detail. It's not letting me leave a comment right now. Oh, here we go. So there's just the donation page, and without any more ado, I'm going to start talking to you about taphonomy. So, taphonomy is the study of what happens to organic materials after death. It's a term that is also used in paleontology, and it sort of comes to us from there, where it's specifically looking at how these organic materials become fossils. In archaeology, that's not really we're not usually looking at quite that long a time frame, although it does happen. But usually when we're talking about taphonomy, what we're really looking at is what happens to an organic object that helps explain how it becomes part of the archaeological record after death, including those important processes of decay. So some of those processes have impacts that are not limited necessarily to organic materials, though, and so they need to be taken into account for any kind of remains. But usually when we're talking about taphonomy, it is specific to those organic remains. So it's important because it helps us understand how to interpret what we're seeing. So is this part of a natural process, or is it cultural? Has something happened to the remains after they were deposited that affects how we interpret what we're seeing? So really it's a big part of how we understand context in archaeology. It's closely linked to site formation. So when we're talking about archaeology, so site formation is sort of a broader context, is looking at how a site came to be in its current state. But obviously they are closely linked, as usually when we're looking at materials that are part of a site, and they're broader to these broader subject to these broader forces that are impacting the site as a whole. So it is part of that important context and understanding of what we're seeing and how that's affecting, or how those changes that an artifact has undergone are affecting our interpretations when we're trying to understand what we're seeing archaeologically. So then a big part of taphonomy is understanding how organic materials decay after death. and how those processes can be affected or impacted by different environments. So how they actually rot is a big part of taphonomy. So Katie's talked a little bit in her kids talk on organic materials a few weeks ago, and if you watched her activity on post molds and longhouses earlier this week, she's talked a little bit about some of these, and I know I mentioned it as well when I was talking about the Norton site. So post molds are a good way sort of to think about taphonomy, because we're talking about wood that's rotting in place. And so we know that wood's been buried will rot, and it's how it does is impacted by things like soil chemistry, by bacteria that are in the soils, by insects, and so forth. And as it does so, the nutrients from that organic material decompose, will change the actual soil and leave a discolored stain that helps us identify that there was that organic material there. So there's a lot of really technical information that I'm not going to really claim to understand here that when it comes to these processes, but it's just important to think about, when we are interpreting archaeological remains, it comes down to context, understanding what might be impacting these natural processes and how it affects what we see on a site. So when we're finding the things that we're finding, why are we finding them and not other things? Like, why are we not finding wood? How do we know that this represents something that used to be wood? All these kinds of questions come down to taphonomy. So how these things actually decay and other processes that are impacting that decay itself, and how remains are where they are. So the first thing we need to sort of think about is the different ways that things can become part of the archaeological record. So how and why are they discarded? In the case of things that were once alive, and then how did it die has a big impact in this as well. So, was a tree cut down? Was it burned? So on and so forth. So the first thing that we really need to determine is whether or not it's part of the archaeological record at all. So does it actually have anything to do with human activities, or is there some other kind of process at work? For example, if a groundhog dies in a burrow that's been dug into an archaeological site. So archaeologists have to learn to recognize the difference between remains that are part of a site and that are intrusive to it, that are intruding into it. So finding groundhog remains mixed in with artifacts doesn't necessarily mean that there was some kind of important cultural relationships between people who left those remains and those groundhogs, but there could be another link. So for example, if people have dug up an area, if they were living there, or if they were using it for agriculture themselves, that might make the soil easier to burrow into, and then becomes a more attractive habitat for groundhogs. So we have to understand these kinds of relationships as well when we're trying to interpret what we're finding on a site. So let's take an example, though, of things that are culturally linked and talk a little bit about faunal remains. So faunal remains are bones of animals, generally speaking, that we find in archaeological contexts. So if we're looking at a food animal, for example, so we want to think about how did it die? So again, that's a big part of taphonomy. So did it die of disease or old age, or was it purposefully killed? And there's probably some other options in there too, but we'll look at these three. So diseases of different types can leave indications on the body and on the skeleton, and people who study these can often tell whether or not that disease was actually a factor in the death of the animal or not. So diseased animals might not be treated the same way as healthy ones. So they might not be butchered for food, for example, but they might be discarded in some other way. Animals that are found to have died of natural causes that are found on archaeological sites often reflect a different kind of relationships to humans. And that's, again, if we can determine that these are actually archaeological animals and not just intrusive ones. But pets, for example, are an example, are one thing that we do see. So that kind of relationship where it's not just a food animal, it's more of a companion or maybe a working animal of some kind, might have an opportunity to live to old age that other kinds of animals would not. But if we're looking again at a food animal, so then was it that was purposefully killed? Was it hunted? So was it captured and killed in a wild environment? Was it slaughtered on a farm or maybe in a commercial slaughterhouse? And then after it was killed, where was it butchered? So these different circumstances can lead to vastly different archaeological assemblages. Those are the kinds of things that you will find. So for example, if a large animal was hunted, it might have been butchered on the spot. So like cut up for the parts that the people wanted from that animal might have been taken away from the space that it was actually killed, and some of those remains left behind. Or it might have been brought to an intermediary like campsite for butchering and other kinds of processing. So some parts could be left there and then others brought back to like a homestead or a village later on. If it was slaughtered on a farm, then it's maybe more likely that all of the parts of the animal are at least kept on the same site, even if they're not together. So there might be a different place to discard unused parts of the animal versus parts that were used for food or other things. So how it's broken up is also going to impact what we find archaeologically. So, but people who are receiving only butchered meat, so meat that's prepared for eating, whether that's something that's been bought in a store or something that's been redistributed by other means, like brought back to a village and given out to people who are non-hunters, they're going to leave very different assemblages. So we might find that campsite is one archaeological site and the village is another, and we'll find different parts of an animal in those different contexts, which again can tell us some of these about cultural relationships, right? So how meat is butchered is also a cultural process, and it's also influenced by things like technology and other kinds of food ways. So if you can imagine, people who have primarily like a stone toolkit versus people who have access to like an electrically powered tools like saws, for example, are going to be able to cut up a carcass very differently. Cooking technology also comes into play. So the kinds of cuts that you might, like cuts of meat that you might use when you're doing open fire cooking over a hearth or boiling in a pot versus roasting in an enclosed oven or something fancy like using a sous vide, they're going to be prepared very differently. And so that is going to affect how that meat is butchered. As you can imagine, this is also going to impact what we can find archaeologically and help us make, again, these different kinds of interpretations about what people were eating and their relationships to animals, and that we can see archaeologically based on how these animals died and what happened to them after death, right? So that's all part of taphonomy. So, of course, animals can contribute more than just food. So we have leather, bone, horns, antlers, teeth. All of these things can be used in different ways, maybe as tools or different adornments or other ways. And those kinds of alterations and that use of that material is also part of the taphonomy of that animal. So what happened to those after death, right? So in some cases, we can see the harvesting of those elements, but sometimes what we'll just find is the tools themselves. So again, just different relationships. So what we need to understand is also, what can happen to things after they are discarded. So after the tool is broken, after the food is eaten, it's been thrown away. What are the agents that act on those remains, and what are their effects and processes? So these are also really important questions to consider when we're looking at taphonomy and we're trying to understand what we're seeing archaeologically. So when we're looking at the agents, there's different kinds of agents of things that will act on discarded organic remains. So some are biological, for example, scavengers, which can be small like insects, up to like large like scavenging animals like bears even. There's also bacteria and fungi that will grow and interact with these remains and eat them or whatever. There's environmental ones, so soil, for example. The soil itself will have an impact, like what its pH is and so forth. Water, temperature and humidity, wind, and decomposition after death. Just the natural ways in it that living things tend to break down after they die, like those chemical processes that happen in the body also impact what we find archaeologically. So those are the sort of the agents, and then the processes is how these actually act on those remains. So I'm going to just talk about a few of them, not in too much detail, because of course I'm sure you can imagine this gets really complicated to think about. So the first is bioturbation. So turbation is just sort of turbulence, mixing things up, and bio, of course, means alive. So things being mixed up by other living things. So this can be things like tree roots, for example, pushing through deposits. So it might, like, a tree root could grow through part of an archaeological deposit, especially if there's organic remains. Those can help provide nutrients to trees and other kinds of plant life, so they can be an attractive place for those sorts of things to grow. It can also, again, be, when we're talking about scavengers, it can be them just physically dragging parts of a carcass off, for example. It can be also human actions like plowing. So I actually have a couple of examples of this to talk about. One is just from this past Easter weekend. So I live near sort of a wooded park in London, and somebody had decided that the best way to dispose of the turkey that they'd had for their Easter dinner was to sort of toss it over the edge of the path, just where there's sort of like a ravine. And I was walking my dog, who decided that this discarded turkey carcass looked real delicious and tried to grab part of it, so tearing it away from that part of the carcass, before I had a chance to stop him. Now I did get it away from him. I got him to drop it. But it had definitely disturbed that site of deposition, so we're talking about a little bit of scavenging action and another, human action, so sort of disperse those remains a little bit from where they had been originally discarded, again, by human activity. So another example of this is the Neanderthal burials in Shanidar Caves. And this is really the example that made me want to do this as an MOA live talk, because I was doing some research for the last one I did about paleobotany. So I had remembered learning back when I was in my undergrad ages ago that there had been flower pollen that was found with one of these Neanderthal burials from about 60,000 years ago. And it had been interpreted at the time that people had actually left flowers with this particular burial. So that there was a Neanderthal that had been buried and people had left flowers at that burial site, was the interpretation. So I wanted to sort of include that in my talk about paleoarchaeology, paleobotany, because it was pretty cool. But when I actually went back to check my facts on that, what I found is that more recently they had reinterpreted what they'd found. And rather than evidence that people had left flowers with the deceased, in this case, they'd actually determined that what had happened was that there's these small burrowing mammals, kind of like mice or voles sort of things in this area in Iran, that are known to stockpile different foods, including plant remains. And so what they'd actually gone back and looked more closely, what they found is that this pollen was actually coming out of the burrows of these animals, leaving the pollen behind. So it was not actually culturally deposited at all. It's just one of these other examples of intrusive material and of animals burrowing into an archaeological site and disturbing what's there, and even introducing new material that can complicate our interpretations. So we have to be really careful when we're looking at these archaeological sites that we're not letting, that we're being very careful in terms of understanding what we're seeing and making those interpretations. Because it can be easy to get confused and to get excited about something that seems really neat. But we just have to sort of step back and ask ourselves like a lot of questions about when we're trying to make assertions or make interpretations. Just consider all the possibilities and then try and eliminate them to get to what is more likely to be the case. So another example of bioturbation in Ontario that we encounter quite a lot is actually plowing. So that's human activity. And that's partly because a lot of sites are, when you are plowing rather, it tends to bring archaeological artifacts that are in that top layer of soil up to the surface. So it brings things up, so it makes it easier to find sites. That's actually when people are doing archaeological survey, they like to survey in plowed fields in the spring when things have been churned up, because it makes it easier to know that a site is there. There's also trampling, so that can be either human activity or maybe animals if things are in a pasture, for example, just trampling down on the soil, compacting it and crushing, potentially crushing artifacts that are below that top level of soil. That can have an impact on how things degrade, breaking it up into smaller pieces, for example. When you get back to scavengers, just like the actual action of things chewing on like faunal remains, like so that those teeth marks, like gnawing on it, that can help break up remains and have an influence on how we're trying to make interpretations of things. We have to again recognize, is this human is this a result of something that has been part of the archaeological record, or is it something that has happened after it was deposited in the archaeological record, something else having an impact on those remains? There's also chemistry. I mentioned this a little bit when I was talking about soils, but the pH level, so whether or not it's acidic or alkaline, is going to have an impact on how things decay. Alkaline environments can promote the preservation of some kinds of materials. So the presence of absence of oxygen in the soil or in the environment also impacts what kinds of bacteria are involved in processes of decay, which can have a huge impact on whether or not organic materials preserve at all. So environments with less oxygen tend to lead to better preservation, for example, because oxygen is actually very destructive. So other kinds of environmental processes are also very significant. So the freezing and thawing, if you're in a climate where that occurs, that can lead to the breakup of organic materials. It's because organic materials tend to absorb water, which expands then when it freezes. And so you get that sort of expanding and shrinking over time, which can be very damaging to an object. You can probably imagine. There's some kinds of soils that do this as well. So soil that has a lot of clay in it, that clay will absorb a lot of water. And then if it gets dried out, you'll get like cracks in the clay itself. And these create crevices that small artifacts can actually fall into, which again is breaking up the association of particular remains. It can confuse stratigraphy as well. Other environmental factors are flooding. So you can imagine flooding, either regular spring floods or maybe flash floods from heavy rains, can both wash materials out of context along the shoreline. They can also bury materials that have been exposed in new layers of sediment. So again, it's changing the environment in which something is decaying that can have an impact on what it looks like over a long period of time, especially if it's gone through different phases of being exposed and then buried and exposed and then buried. So wind can also lead to erosion, so that can expose elements, and it can also directly impact them. So you can actually erode the surface of an object as opposed to just the environment that it's in as well. So it can also lead to an effect that we call scouring. So if you can imagine that there's something lying in the sand, the wind might not be strong enough to blow it away, but it can blow away all of the sand that's in the sediment that's around it, and so it can sort of hollow out an area in front of it or build it up behind. And so that can actually cause an artifact to sink lower into the ground over time. And so in the same way, the scouring effect can really confuse stratigraphy. So in some cases, the pits caused by scouring around heavy objects can get filled in with other material, which is going to create an appearance of a relationship between objects that may or may not actually exist. So you have to be aware of the environment when you're trying to make interpretations about how different artifacts and features relate to each other. Wind erosion can also just simply blow things away. So if there are smaller elements that are associated with an artifact or like with a feature, it can just blow things away, leaving only those larger and heavier materials, which will again impact what there is left to make interpretations about, and can confuse the associations between objects. There's also major events like landslides, for example, and you can imagine the kinds of dramatic impacts that they might have on sites and artifacts that are in those sites. If you're talking about a submerged or a coastal environment, you get similar kinds of processes, because basically anything that wind can do, water can also do. So you have tides and currents that provide agitation and scouring effects again. You have wave action that's causing tumbling, so think of like beach glass that's been polished and rounded off. So it's changing the nature of those artifacts in that way. So, and even just water running over an object, if it's in this place, can be a force of erosion over time. So it's changing the surface of those objects, and it can hurt our ability to make interpretations by confusing the shape, removing diagnostic features, and so forth. So waters can also separate remains in ways that might not happen on land. So gases produced during decomposition, so again during those natural processes of decay for organic matter, can cause things to float away from their original location of deposition. So that's not as likely to happen on land, but can happen quite frequently in a submerged environment. So in a very dry environment like a desert, the lack of moisture can actually help prevent some kinds of decay, which also, again, will have an impact on what does preserve, what it looks like, and again, that is an impact or impacts that taphonomy. So what it looks like after it's been sitting there for decades or hundreds of years or even longer. So like some of the other things I've talked about in these live talks, there's a lot more complexity that you can get into when you're talking about taphonomy. But what I really wanted to get across here was just that, again, to help you think about how things get into the archaeological record and just have a taste of some of the things that archaeologists have to think about when we're trying to understand what we're seeing. So it's not really as straightforward as just seeing some artifacts together and being able to draw immediate conclusions. There's really a lot more to think about in terms of making those interpretations. So just finding an artifact without having that broader context isn't really enough. So it's really that specialized archaeological knowledge that people bring into the field when they're making these interpretations or looking back through the records of the work that they've made in the field and putting that into a broader context of what they know about the environment that helps us really understand what we're seeing and to be able to say that this is something that we know versus just something we think or we found these things. So it's just helping us make clearer interpretations of the archaeological record the more context we have. So thanks again for joining me. And once, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be having Dr. Neil Ferris give us a talk on Thursday about the Matthew Elliott site, which is a really kind of a neat site. But I'll leave it for him to give you all the details, and thank you again for joining us. I'll be back on next Tuesday, and I think at this point my plan is to talk about how objects get into museum collections. So talk a little bit about museum collecting practices and policies a little bit to give you that context and a little bit specifically about what we are doing at the Museum of Ontario Archaeology. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.